Vice Admiral Jinichi Kusaka sat alone in his command quarters at Rabaul, pen trembling above the page of his personal journal. Outside, the South Pacific night pressed against the walls like a living thing. He wrote slowly, each character a confession. American forces were not coming. They had decided his garrison, his men, his entire strategic position were not worth the cost of their bullets. 100,000 Imperial Japanese troops, fortified, trained, waiting for the battle that would define their honor, had been rendered completely, utterly irrelevant. The Americans had simply chosen to let them rot. The realization did not arrive as a thunderclap, but as a slow, creeping horror that spread through the Japanese military command structure like poison through water. For generations, Japanese naval and ground doctrine had been built upon a foundation of certainty. The enemy would come, there would be battle, and in that battle, honor would manifest itself through sacrifice, courage, and blood. The calculus was simple and ancient. Fortify the critical islands. Garrison them with the best troops. Prepare defenses so formidable that the enemy would break themselves upon them. Even in defeat, even in death, there would be meaning. There would be recognition. There would be the bitter validation that comes from forcing an adversary to acknowledge your existence through the weight of their casualties. This doctrine was not merely tactical. It was philosophical, rooted in centuries of military tradition that valorized the defensive stand, the refusal to yield, the transformation of certain death into transcendent meaning through the manner of one's dying. Japanese officers had studied the great defensive battles of history, had internalized the lessons of sieges and last stands, had been taught that a well-prepared defensive position, held by determined troops willing to die rather than retreat, could inflict casualties far out of proportion to the defenders' numbers. This was supposed to be Japan's advantage, the counterbalance to American industrial and numerical superiority. Let the Americans come with their greater numbers, their superior equipment. Let them crash against fortified positions held by men who feared dishonor more than death. Let them learn that every island would cost them so dearly in blood that eventually their political will would crack, and they would accept a negotiated peace that left Japan with at least some of what it had fought to gain. But the United States had looked at this doctrine, at these fortified islands bristling with artillery and honeycomb with tunnels, at these garrisons of elite troops awaiting their moment of transcendent violence, and had made a different calculation entirely. They had asked a question that Japanese military planners had never seriously considered. What if we simply do not engage? What if we treat these fortifications not as obstacles to be overcome, but as problems to be ignored? What if we render strength itself into a liability, by removing the battlefield upon which that strength could ever be expressed? The answer to that question began to take shape in the pre-dawn darkness of late June 1943, when American forces came ashore not at Rabaul, not at Truk, not at any of the heavily defended positions where Japanese commanders had concentrated their best units and their most sophisticated defensive preparations. Instead, they landed at places called Woodlark and Kirwina, tiny specks in the vastness of the Pacific that most maps barely acknowledged. There was no significant Japanese presence on these islands. There was no battle. There was only the methodical work of construction battalions carving airstrips out of jungle and coral, creating new bases from which American air power could extend its reach further into the Japanese defensive perimeter. The landings were so uneventful that many Japanese commanders did not learn of them for days, and when they did, the strategic implication was not immediately clear. It seemed tactical, opportunistic, perhaps even desperate, this avoidance of real combat. But it was not opportunistic. It was systematic. It was the physical manifestation of a strategic revolution that would unravel the entire Japanese defensive system across the Central and Southwest Pacific. When American forces moved against New Georgia and the Central Solomons, they did not attempt to eliminate every Japanese position on the island. They seized the airfield at Munda, fought brutally for that specific objective, and once secured, they stopped. Japanese units still occupied large portions of New Georgia. They were still capable of resistance. They were still dangerous. But the Americans had already moved on, already turned their attention to the next target, leaving behind just enough force to contain the isolated Japanese units while the bulk of American combat power surged forward to the next island, the next airfield, the next strategic position that would tighten the noose around Japan itself. This was the birth of what would come to be known as island hopping, or leapfrogging, a strategic approach so alien to Japanese military philosophy that many commanders struggled to comprehend it even as it systematically dismantled their entire defensive architecture. The logic was ruthless in its efficiency. Identify the critical nodes in the Japanese defensive network, the islands whose geography made them indispensable for projecting air and naval power. Seize those nodes and bypass everything else. Let the bypassed garrisons sit in their fortifications. Let them maintain their readiness. Let them wait for the battle that would never come. Every soldier, every gun, every fortification on a bypassed island became a strategic liability for Japan, combat power locked away in a place where it could never influence the outcome of the war. The Japanese High Command watched this pattern emerge with growing alarm and mounting frustration. Initial reports from the field spoke of American forces landing on insignificant islands, building infrastructure, and then vanishing over the horizon before Japanese reinforcements could arrive. At first, this seemed like tactical confusion, perhaps even weakness, an unwillingness to commit to sustained combat. But as the pattern repeated itself across the Solomon Islands, across the Bismarck Archipelago, across the vast spaces of the Central Pacific, a darker truth became inescapable. The Americans were not confused. They were executing a coherent strategic vision that treated the entire Japanese defensive perimeter not as a line to be breached, but as a network to be unraveled selectively, thread by thread, leaving vast sections of that network intact but completely severed from strategic relevance. Operation Cartwheel brought this strategy into full, devastating flower. Launched in June 1943 and continuing through March 1944, Cartwheel was not a single battle but a vast, coordinated series of operations spanning the Southwest Pacific, designed with one overarching objective: neutralize Rabaul without taking it. Rabaul was the linchpin of Japanese defenses in the region, a massive base complex on the island of New Britain, defended by tens of thousands of troops, protected by extensive air and naval forces, fortified to a degree that made direct assault almost unthinkable. Japanese planners had invested enormously in making Rabaul invulnerable, and by conventional military logic, they had succeeded. The base was a fortress. So the Americans isolated it instead. They seized islands around it. They built airfields that brought Rabaul within range of constant air attack. They cut the supply lines that kept the garrison fed and armed. They turned Rabaul from an offensive stronghold into a defensive prison, a place where Japanese forces could do nothing but endure bombardment and starvation, while the war moved past them, inexorably, toward Japan itself. By early 1944, Rabaul had effectively ceased to exist as a strategic asset. The base still functioned. The troops were still there, but they no longer mattered. They had been erased from the war without ever being destroyed. The psychological impact of this strategic erasure was profound and multifaceted. For the Japanese troops stationed at Rabaul and other bypass positions, the initial response was often confusion and disbelief. They had prepared for battle. They had trained for the moment when American forces would attempt to land, would fight their way through the beaches, would push into the interior where every meter of ground would be contested with fanatical determination. They had imagined death, certainly, but death with meaning, death that would inflict maximum cost on the enemy, death that would be remembered and honored. Instead, they experienced something far worse: irrelevance. The Americans bombed them periodically, enough to ensure they could not relax, not enough to suggest that a full invasion was imminent. Supplies stopped arriving with regularity. The naval convoys that had once kept the garrisons functioning attempted to break through American submarine blockades and were destroyed with increasing frequency. Their cargoes sent to the bottom, their crews lost. By early 1944, the supply situation at Rabaul and similar bypass positions had become catastrophic. Frontline combat units found themselves transformed into subsistence farmers. Orders came down from command to establish vegetable gardens, to cultivate every available piece of arable land, to prioritize food production over combat readiness, because without food, there would be no garrison left to defend anything. Elite troops who had been trained for offensive operations, who had been indoctrinated with the virtues of aggressive, decisive action, found themselves planting sweet potatoes and tending to crops with the same intensity they had once reserved for weapons drills. The humiliation was profound, but the alternative was starvation. The daily reality of life on these bypassed islands evolved into a grim routine of survival that bore almost no resemblance to military service as the troops had understood it. Morning formations still occurred, but they were increasingly populated by men whose uniforms hung loose on frames wasted by malnutrition, whose eyes reflected not determination, but the hollow exhaustion of bodies consuming themselves for energy. Medical supplies ran out first, then ammunition for training exercises, then fuel for generators, then anything that could be remotely classified as non-essential. What remained was food, and even that dwindled to the point where every calorie became a subject of careful calculation and bitter internal politics. Officers, trained to lead men in combat, found themselves instead mediating disputes over garden plots, enforcing rationing systems that gave every man barely enough to stay alive, watching their commands deteriorate not through enemy action, but through the slow, grinding attrition of enforced idleness and starvation. On more remote bypassed islands like Wake and WWII, the transformation was even more complete. These garrisons had been established to serve as forward defensive positions, threats to American lines of communication, bases from which Japanese forces could launch counterattacks or disrupt enemy operations. But as the American advance moved past them, as the front lines shifted hundreds and then thousands of miles away, these garrisons ceased to have any military function whatsoever. They were too isolated to threaten American supply lines. They were too weak to launch meaningful offensive operations. They were simply there, consuming resources that Japan could not afford to send them, waiting for orders that never came, for relief that never materialized, for battles that never developed. Gradually, inevitably, these garrisons stopped being military units in any meaningful sense. They became communities focused entirely on survival, on extending their rations, on fishing, on farming, on enduring the endless months and years of isolation with no clear sense of purpose or endpoint. The strategic brilliance of island hopping was not merely in the resources it saved American forces by avoiding costly assaults on fortified positions. It was in the way it transformed Japanese strength into Japanese weakness. Every soldier on a bypassed island was a soldier who could not be redeployed to defend the islands that actually mattered. Japanese command structure was rigidly hierarchical, and moving large numbers of troops from one theater to another required naval transport capacity that Japan simply did not possess, particularly after American submarine warfare began systematically destroying Japanese merchant shipping. The troops were stuck. The fortifications were stuck. The massive investments in concrete and steel and ammunition were stuck. More than 300,000 Japanese troops would eventually find themselves isolated on bypassed islands, combat effective, well-armed, and completely unable to influence the course of the war in any meaningful way. The submarines were perhaps the most devastating component of this isolation strategy, though their role often received less attention than the dramatic carrier battles and amphibious assaults that defined the public perception of the Pacific War. American submarines operated with increasing impunity across Japanese shipping lanes, torpedoing merchant vessels, tankers, and troop transports with methodical efficiency. Each ship sent to the bottom represented not just a loss of material but a severing of connections, a further tightening of the noose around bypassed garrisons. Japanese commanders on isolated islands would wait for supply convoys that had been sunk weeks earlier, unaware that the ships they were expecting lay broken on the ocean floor, their cargoes scattered, their crews dead or dying in the water. The psychological impact of this uncertainty was corrosive. Hope deferred day after day, week after week, month after month, eventually ceased to be hope at all and became instead a kind of bitter acceptance that relief would never arrive, that the war had moved on, that they had been left behind to face whatever fate isolation would bring. While the bypassed garrisons withered, American forces continued their advance with accelerating momentum. The seizure of the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, each operation bringing American air and naval power closer to the Japanese home islands, each operation demonstrating the same ruthless selectivity. Take what is strategically necessary, bypass what is not, maintain tempo, never allow the Japanese military to concentrate its forces or choose the battlefield. The psychological impact on Japanese command was devastating. They could see the pattern, could understand what was happening, but they had no effective counter. Moving troops off bypassed islands was nearly impossible. Abandoning fortified positions was doctrinally unthinkable and would have been seen as cowardice, as a betrayal of the troops who had been sent there to fight and die. So the garrison stayed, and the isolation deepened, and the strategic situation continued to deteriorate. The destruction of Japanese naval aviation, a process that began with the constant attrition of Operation Cartwheel and reached its catastrophic crescendo during the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in June 1944, removed the last realistic possibility that Japan could reverse the trajectory of the war. In a single day of aerial combat, American carrier-based fighters slaughtered Japanese pilots and aircraft at a ratio that approached 10-to-1. These were not poorly trained conscripts. These were the pilots Japan had spent years training, the elite of the Naval Air Service, and they were annihilated in a matter of hours. The loss was not just material but existential. Japan did not have the fuel, the time, or the industrial capacity to replace these pilots or the aircraft they flew. The balance of naval air power, already tilted heavily in favor of the United States, became so lopsided that Japanese carriers could no longer operate effectively in any contested space. This aerial supremacy allowed the United States to conduct operations like Operation Hailstone against Truk, the so-called Gibraltar of the Pacific, a massive Japanese naval base in the Caroline Islands. Truk had been fortified and garrisoned with the expectation that it would serve as an impregnable stronghold, a place where Japanese naval forces could regroup, refit, and project power across vast stretches of the Pacific. American carrier aircraft attacked Truk in February 1944 with overwhelming force, sinking dozens of ships, destroying hundreds of aircraft, and rendering the base effectively useless as a forward naval facility. The attack came in waves, relentless and coordinated, exploiting gaps in Japanese air defenses that had once been formidable, but had been degraded by months of attrition and supply shortages. Japanese defenders fought desperately, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of American air power, by the technical sophistication of American aircraft and tactics, by the brutal arithmetic of a battle where one side could afford losses and the other could not. And then, having demonstrated their complete dominance, American forces bypassed Truk entirely. They did not invade. They did not occupy. They simply moved on, leaving the garrison to sit in the ruins of what had once been a symbol of Japanese naval might, cut off, irrelevant, waiting. The psychological shock of Operation Hailstone reverberated through other bypass garrisons. If Truk, massively fortified, heavily defended, strategically critical, could be neutralized so completely, and then simply ignored, what did that say about their own positions, their own prospects? The message was clear and devastating. American forces had grown so powerful, so confident in their supremacy, that they could destroy a major base and then not even bother to occupy it because the strategic situation had evolved to the point where Truk no longer mattered enough to justify the resources an invasion would require. This was not the grinding attrition of equal adversaries slowly wearing each other down. This was dominance so complete that the dominant power could afford to be selective about which victories it chose to pursue. The fall of Saipan in July 1944 marked a turning point not just strategically, but psychologically. Saipan was close enough to the Japanese home islands that American bombers based there could reach Tokyo. Its loss meant that the war had come home in a way that could not be denied or minimized by propaganda. But Saipan also represented the final, conclusive proof that the island-hopping strategy had worked. The American advance had moved from the Solomons to the Gilberts to the Marshalls to the Marianas, in a relentless progression that Japanese forces had been unable to stop or even significantly slow. At every stage, Japanese commanders had hoped that the next defensive line would be the one where American momentum would finally break, where the cost of continuing the advance would become prohibitive. At every stage, those hopes had been disappointed. The bypassed garrisons, numbering now in the hundreds of thousands of troops, represented the greatest misallocation of military resources in the Pacific War. Combat power locked away on islands that no longer mattered, while the critical battles were fought elsewhere by forces that were increasingly outnumbered and outmatched. The news of Saipan's fall reached some bypass garrisons through intercepted radio broadcasts, fragmented reports that many soldiers initially refused to believe. Saipan had been considered secure, had been fortified with the same care and investment as their own positions, had been garrisoned by troops just as elite, just as determined, just as willing to die. If Saipan could fall, if American forces could overcome those defenses despite the horrific casualties such assaults inevitably inflicted, then what hope remained for any defensive position anywhere? The psychological foundation upon which Japanese military morale rested, the belief that sufficient determination and sacrifice could overcome material disadvantage, began to crack. Not everywhere, not all at once, but in ways that could not be repaired through discipline or ideology or appeals to honor. Some Japanese commanders, recognizing that the old doctrines had failed, attempted to adapt. On islands like Iwo Jima and later Okinawa, where American forces could not bypass the objective because of its geographic or strategic significance, Japanese defenders constructed elaborate underground defensive networks, vast tunnel complexes designed not to hold the island indefinitely, but to maximize American casualties. to make every yard of ground so expensive in American blood that the political will to continue the war would fracture. These defenses were tactically brilliant and horrifically effective. The battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa would be among the bloodiest in the Pacific War, measured in tens of thousands of American casualties and near total annihilation of Japanese defenders. But these battles, as costly as they were, could not change the fundamental strategic reality. The island-hopping strategy had already decided the outcome of the war. These late-war battles were brutal endgames, not turning points. As 1945 progressed and Japan's strategic situation became increasingly hopeless, the bypassed garrisons entered a final, surreal phase of their existence. Cut off from regular communication with higher command, running on starvation rations, or subsisting entirely on locally grown food, many of these garrisons had no clear understanding of how the war was progressing. They heard rumors. They intercepted occasional radio broadcasts. But the information was fragmentary and often contradictory. Some garrisons believed that Japan was winning, that their isolation was temporary, that relief forces would eventually arrive. Others suspected the truth but could not bring themselves to fully accept it. The rituals of military life continued. Formations, drills, the maintenance of weapons and equipment that would never be used in combat. These rituals provided structure, a sense of purpose in a situation that had become fundamentally purposeless. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the news did not reach all of the bypassed garrisons immediately. Some did not learn of the surrender for weeks. A few did not learn of it for months. The delay was partly logistical, the difficulty of communicating with remote islands that had been cut off from regular contact for so long, but it was also psychological. Accepting surrender meant accepting that everything they had endured, the hunger, the isolation, the fear, the endless waiting, had been for nothing. It meant accepting that their sacrifice had not delayed the American advance by a single day, that their presence on these islands had not altered the course of the war in any measurable way. For men who had been raised in a culture that venerated military sacrifice and taught that death in service of the emperor was the highest possible honor, this realization was devastating in ways that went beyond mere defeat. The mechanics of surrender on the bypassed islands varied wildly. On some islands, the process was orderly, almost ceremonial, Japanese officers formally surrendering their commands to Allied representatives who arrived by ship or aircraft. On other islands, particularly the most remote ones, the process was chaotic and confused. Some garrisons surrendered immediately upon learning of Japan's capitulation. Others refused to believe the news, convinced it was enemy propaganda designed to trick them into laying down their arms. Small groups of soldiers, in some cases individual men, refused to surrender at all, disappearing into the jungle to continue a war that existed now only in their minds. These holdouts would emerge periodically over the following years, sometimes decades, bewildered men who had been so thoroughly isolated that they had ceased to exist in historical time, frozen in 1942 or 1943 or 1944, unaware that the world had moved on without them. The island-hopping strategy succeeded not because it was gentle or humane, but because it was ruthlessly efficient. It achieved American strategic objectives, the defeat of Japan and the liberation of Japanese-occupied territories, at a lower cost in American lives than a campaign of direct assault on every fortified position would have required. This was the calculus that mattered to American planners, and by that measure, the strategy was a triumph. But the human cost of that triumph, particularly for the Japanese troops consigned to bypassed islands, was immense and often invisible. These men did not die in glorious last stands. They did not get to express their courage or their commitment through dramatic sacrifice. They simply waited and starved and grew gardens, and eventually learned that none of it had mattered, that they had been strategically erased from the war while they were still alive to experience that erasure. The long-term strategic implications of island hopping extended beyond the immediate defeat of Japan. The strategy demonstrated that in modern warfare, particularly in the vast geographic theater of the Pacific, mobility and strategic selectivity could overcome numerical inferiority and heavily fortified defensive positions. It proved that the initiative, the ability to choose where and when to fight, was worth more than the most elaborate fortifications. It showed that isolation could be as effective as destruction, that rendering an enemy irrelevant was sometimes preferable to annihilating them, because irrelevance consumed fewer resources and allowed the tempo of operations to be maintained. These lessons would inform American military doctrine for generations, shaping approaches to strategy and operations in conflicts far removed from the island jungles of the South Pacific. For Vice Admiral Kusaka and the other Japanese commanders who found themselves presiding over bypassed garrisons, the experience was one of slow, grinding demoralization. They had been trained to think in terms of decisive battle, of concentration of force, of the offensive spirit that would overcome material disadvantage through superior will and courage. The island-hopping strategy rendered all of these principles irrelevant. There would be no decisive battle because the Americans refused to provide one. Concentration of force was impossible because the garrisons were isolated and could not be reinforced or evacuated. The offensive spirit had nowhere to express itself because there were no targets within reach, no enemy positions to assault, no way to take the initiative. All that remained was defense without purpose, waiting without end, a slow dissolution of military cohesion and morale that no amount of discipline or ideological commitment could fully prevent. The stories of individual soldiers on these bypassed islands, when they were eventually told, revealed the depth of the psychological trauma that isolation and strategic irrelevance could inflict. Men who had once been confident, who had believed in their mission and their cause, who had accepted the possibility of death as a necessary component of military service, found themselves instead facing something they had not been prepared for: survival without meaning. The question that haunted many of these men was not whether they would die, but whether their lives, their suffering, their endurance would be remembered or acknowledged or understood by anyone beyond the tiny, shrinking world of their isolated garrison. For some, the answer to that question was unbearable. The island-hopping strategy succeeded because it understood and exploited a fundamental vulnerability in Japanese military psychology and doctrine. It took the things that Japanese forces were best at: defensive fortification, disciplined endurance, willingness to fight to the last man, and rendered those strengths irrelevant by removing the context in which they could be exercised. It was a strategy born of pragmatism, of calculation, of the recognition that wars are won not by fighting every battle, but by fighting only the battles that matter. The cost of that pragmatism, measured in Japanese lives and Japanese suffering, was enormous. But in the brutal arithmetic of total war, that cost was not American, and therefore, to the planners who designed and executed the strategy, it did not fundamentally matter. As the war ended and the process of repatriation began, the soldiers from the bypassed islands returned to a Japan that had been transformed almost beyond recognition, a nation devastated by firebombing and atomic weapons, occupied by foreign troops, stripped of its empire and its military traditions. They returned to find that their sacrifices, their years of isolation and hunger, were barely acknowledged, sometimes not even known. The great battles, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the naval engagements at Midway and Leyte Gulf, these were the events that defined the war in public memory. The slow death of the bypassed garrisons, the strategic irrelevance of hundreds of thousands of troops who had been prepared to die but were instead left to waste away, this received far less attention. It was a footnote to the larger narrative, a detail that did not fit comfortably into stories of heroism or sacrifice or even defeat with honor. It was simply what had happened to men who had been in the wrong place, defending the wrong islands, when the nature of warfare had shifted beneath their feet. Many of these returning soldiers found themselves unable to articulate what they had experienced. How could they explain to family members who had endured firebombing raids, who had lost children to starvation in the final months of the war, who had watched cities burn, that their own suffering had been different but no less profound? How could they convey the specific psychological torture of military irrelevance, of being forgotten while still alive, of spending years preparing for a battle that everyone else had simply decided would not happen? Some did not try. They returned to their villages or their cities, took up whatever work was available in the shattered economy, and never spoke of the war again. Others spoke obsessively, endlessly, trying to make someone understand what it had meant to sit on a remote island while the world changed without them, but found that their audiences could not grasp the distinction between their experience and ordinary military service, could not understand why being bypassed felt like a deeper violation than being defeated in honest combat. The final lesson of the island-hopping strategy, perhaps the most profound and the most unsettling, was this: in modern war, fought across vast distances with industrial-scale resources, individual courage and sacrifice can be rendered completely meaningless by strategic decision-making that occurs at levels so removed from the individual soldier that he cannot even perceive it, let alone influence it. The Japanese troops on the bypassed islands were not defeated by superior courage or better tactics or more determined fighting. They were defeated by a strategic choice to ignore them, to let geography and logistics do the work that bullets and bombs would have done at far greater cost. They were defeated by being judged not worth the effort of destruction. And in that judgment, in that calculation, there was a cold, terrible efficiency that defined the character of the Pacific War as much as any battle ever could. So what do you think? Was the island-hopping strategy a brilliant innovation that saved countless American lives by avoiding unnecessary battles? Or was it a calculated act of cruelty that condemned hundreds of thousands of men to a slow, invisible death by starvation and irrelevance? Does strategic efficiency justify the human cost when that cost is borne entirely by the enemy? These are not easy questions, and the answers depend on where you stand, on whose lives you value, on whether you believe that in war, the ends always justify the means, or whether there are moral limits that should constrain even the most pragmatic calculations. If this story made you think, if it challenged your assumptions about what war is and what it costs, then subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. The history we choose to remember shapes the future we choose to build, and that choice matters more than we often realize.